This episode of the Design Your Dream Home podcast is brought to you by Crayon. Crayon is the custom residential architects network, and by Porcelanosa. Porcelanosa is a luxury lifestyle brand that brings modern European design into your home. You are listening to the Design Your Dream Home podcast with Doug and Steve. Doug and Steve are architects, and they're here to help you design your dream home.
We are very excited today to have Lucas Gray, who is a principal of Propel Studio, full-service architecture studio based in Portland, Oregon. So Lucas Gray, I know Lucas only through Twitter, like many of my contacts in architecture, which is really interesting, but we interact on Twitter, and I sort of follow his travels around the world. And so very happy to have him join us. Propel Studio is a competition-winning design firm. Their work blends sustainable building strategies and timeless architectural forms with a particular focus on materiality. Lucas Gray brings expertise working with diverse communities throughout the world, offering his services to community groups, nonprofits to create positive change through architecture. Lucas earned his Bachelor of Architecture degree from McGill University. I didn't realize you're Canadian, or maybe not Canadian, but that's in Montreal, and a master's degree from the University of Oregon. He served on the Alberta Main Street Design Committee, was a board member of AI Portland and AI Oregon, has volunteered for Architecture for Humanity, and is the founder of the architecture blog talkitect.com. He's also an adjunct professor at Portland State University and a guest design critic at the University of Oregon. And lastly, I don't want to keep going on, but I did want to note that you participated in Glenn Merkitt's master's class. He's a Pritzker Prize winning architect. And it sounds like this experience honed your interest in sustainable architecture. Welcome, Lucas Gray.
Well, thank you for having me.
Hey, Lucas, thank you.
Hey, before we get into your advice for homeowners and your work in residential design, talk to us about the Glenn Merkitt experience. He's an architect that I really admire. What was that like?
Fantastic experience. So I participated in the 2008 Glenn Merkitt master's class. When I graduated from the University of Oregon in 2008, I then went to Australia for a few weeks to participate in the Glenn Merkitt International Master's class. And it was a really incredible experience, traveling to a new place, exploring a new city, but then getting to learn from Glenn himself, which everyone or most people would probably know as one of the leading architects in the world, Pritzker Prize winner. Architects who are tutors in the class are all amazing designers themselves. So that was Richard Leplastriere, Peter Suchbury, and Britt Anderson were the other architects. And then you're also with a group of 30 architects from around the world. So these are all participants in the class, but they're all practicing architecture in different countries and different cultures. So you're learning a lot from the tutors themselves, but then also your classmates around you. So each year they bring us down to the Arthur and Yvonne Boyd Education Center. And we set up basically a studio there. We're all living on site. There's some basically dorm style rooms. And then the professors assign a site. So when I was there, the program was creating a center of reconciliation. So kind of like a retreat where people can come together to resolve conflict. And they gave us the land that was kind of like a ridge overlooking the river and valley below. So we were basically spending the first week really analyzing the context, the landforms, geography, flora and fauna, the climate, and really trying to get an understanding of the context we're designing for. And that's really how Glenn starts his work. He really wants to make all of his buildings as responsive to the climate and environment that he's building in. So that was just really inspiring. And then we spent about a week there kind of analyzing the land, doing schematic design stuff, all hand-drawn work that you're working in teams of 3 or 4 people. So the first week we're there kind of doing this analysis. And then the second week we go back to Sydney. We were in the studios, I believe, at the University of Sydney and working kind of more in depth to develop the architectural response to the program. But in general, it was an incredible experience and definitely inspired and changed the way that I think about my design work since that experience.
So, Lucas, the Glenn Merkitt experience sounds really interesting. How did you go immediately into a practice on your own, or did you go to work for somebody?
Yeah. So kind of, I guess my career history was a little bit roundabout. So I actually started studying architecture at McGill University, as you mentioned earlier. And then when I graduated, I moved to Thailand, and I lived in Bangkok for a year, working, doing like project management work, basically filing papers and moving drawings around. And
Yeah.
I then moved to Shanghai, China, where I worked for 2 years for a couple boutique design firms.
Oh my gosh.
And then I moved back to the States to do grad school at the University of Oregon. So I studied there for 2 years and then did the Glenmarket class.
Okay.
And one of the reasons I did the Glenmarket class was upon graduation, I applied for a couple scholarship travel grants and scholarships through the university that I received. So the Glenmarket was the first stop on kind of an around the world trip.
Yeah.
So I spent 3 weeks there studying, and then flew to Japan. And then I basically backpacked from Japan to Berlin without flying. So I
Oh my goodness.
took the ferry to Russia and then the train across Russia, and then some ferries around the Baltics, which is also a really incredible experience, and kind of like got my travel juices flowing. And then I lived in Berlin for 2 years, working for a couple different firms there, practicing architecture on vastly different scales. The first firm, we did like small scale residential renovations, additions, and then we actually entered and won a small competition to do like there was like an old sports hall, like gymnasium, that was semi-destroyed during the war. So we kind of renovated this old building and built an addition onto it for locker rooms and changing rooms for a neighborhood in Berlin. And then I left that company after that project and moved to a firm that did projects all over the world. So I was living in Berlin, but I worked on some train station concepts for Russia and some like adaptive reuse contemporary projects in China. So yeah, it was really kind of a diverse international practice, which was really intriguing.
It sounds amazing. What was it like crossing Russia on a train? I'm sure I'm going to jump all over the place here, but that sounds like an incredible experience.
Oh, it was. It's a really amazing. So the vast majority of Russia is empty. So you're on this train for, days with, like, you're not passing cities, you're just going through incredibly rich forests and seeing waterfalls and lakes and rivers. It's really incredible landscape. And then the people are really interesting. People are wondering why you're there, so they want to talk to you. They want to converse and share stories. Kids were always interested, so they would come up and try to teach us card games. Older people would try to share their food. So it was really incredible just seeing how people live in these kind of small, very, isolated communities, really far away from any of the major cities.
And,
So yeah, it was really incredible.
and how has this affected your design work and your architectural practice?
So it's definitely affected how what's the right word? I feel that a lot of architecture practices are very locally focused, particularly smaller scale firms that do residential projects.
Right.
So we've definitely focused on a more international approach. So for instance, we are doing a couple of small projects in Japan at the moment, some commercial work and some community work. And then my business partner, he was born and raised in Vietnam. So we've been collaborating with one of his friends in Vietnam to do to share work. So they do our renderings and they've helped us do some drafting work. And then we're always looking for opportunities in Vietnam for small scale projects with the goal of eventually having an office there.
Yeah.
So yeah, it's definitely been an ever-present part of my career, is how do I kind of combine my love for travel and experiencing different cultures, and then also practicing design.
Really interesting.
I think about the work in Pacific Northwest as having interest in sustainable design, using some of the local materials. I feel like it's very strong, like critically, we call it critical regional design. I really feel like there is a lot of really good practitioners out there that really have a good feeling for that place and the uniqueness of it. Mm-hmm. Is your firm, is it sort of like that as well, or are you able to sort of introduce some of these international or these travels into the work that you're doing there? Or I'm sort of curious how you are able to take, your travel, your world traveling, all the experiences everywhere, and integrate that into the work that you're doing in Portland, or at least that region?
Great question. And I definitely agree with you. I believe that we kind of refer to it as like Northwest modern. But I would say a lot of the architecture here, and particularly contemporary architects, do take a strong influence of the environment and landscape and local materials and use that to inspire their design. I think to answer your question, there's kind of two ways. One, I would say that our work is definitely influenced a lot by Japanese architecture, with kind of these like really simple, basic spaces that provide you with a great place to live. And I think like what Japanese architects do really well that really fits with the Pacific Northwest is a really strong connection to the outdoors. So like buildings that have sliding panels or doors or screens that really kind of open up the inside to the outside when the weather or the climate allows it to happen.
I guess it was sort of awkwardly the way I asked that question, but I was thinking that there are times where you meet a client and let's say the person is well traveled, or they're from another place, and now they're, let's say, living in Portland, and they want to somehow incorporate those life experiences into their new home, but at the same time they don't want it to look like a kind of Frankenstein. So it's a matter of how do you take some of the inspirations from other places and introduce them into and integrate them into a home that's, let's say, designed in Portland. So I think that was kind of my question.
Yeah, I'm going to flip it around a bit to tell one story, and then we can circle back. Talking specifically about our work in Japan, I think one of the interesting things that's happened, so they kind of hired us to run some community engagement workshops, and then that kind of grew into a couple of different projects, one of which was renovating the interior of a furniture store. And we were very inspired by Japanese architecture. So getting cues from kind of their beautiful woodwork and like wood screens and sliding panels and everything. So we did this whole design for them, and they were kind of like lukewarm on it. And we were like, I wonder why. And then after some conversations, and there's a lot of translation that needs to happen, and I believe some of it was lost in the translation, the initial conversations. But basically, it became clear that what they were looking for was the Portland style. So really drawing the inspiration from what we see in the Portland area, particularly with like interior spaces, and then translating that to the Japanese culture, versus us who are trying to be inspired by our experience in Japan and using that to inspire the design. So I think it kind of works both ways. And I think what I've seen in Portland is we have a very, I think, practical approach, but still kind of like combining this. I mean, we have beautiful access to nature with, incredible, lumber resources, kind of this like industrial, like maker culture within the city. So I would say a lot of our spaces have these kind of like industrial modern aesthetics, and then finding ways to translate that to foreign countries was a really interesting challenge. I think it's the same the other direction. So when we're traveling, last November and December, I spent most of the time in Japan and then Vietnam and Singapore for a few different conferences, and really drawing inspiration from these places that are tropical. So like you don't really there's a blurring of the boundaries between indoor and outdoor space, and really creating, even though you might have smaller dwelling sizes, by connecting to the outdoors, it makes that space feel much larger and outdoor living area. And that's something we've kind of interwoven into our practice. So almost all of our projects open up in some way. And we do a lot of accessory dwelling units, so secondary houses or kind of like backyard cottages. And they're very restricted in size. So in Portland, they're a maximum of 800 square feet. So we really have to be creative to find ways for these smaller spaces to really live large. So really connect to the outdoors, have outdoor living areas, sometimes even incorporating outdoor kitchens or living room. So I think that's really been something we've been influenced through our travels.
Lucas, I'm sure many of our listeners have considered hiring an architect at one time or another, but one of the considerations I would assume, is their location, relative to the client. And so, being hired to work in Japan clearly has some challenges, one being distance. And I would also assume that understanding code compliance and zoning and all of those really complex issues is also something that's a challenge. Could you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah. So there are definitely some challenges and hurdles you have to overcome. One of the great things about our society these days is transportation is actually relatively easy. So I can pick up and hop on a plane and be in Tokyo in 10 hours and then take a train to wherever we're working. So that definitely helps a lot. And we do travel to these locations multiple times to make sure that we understand the context we're building for and understand the community and talk to our clients. So that's the first kind of approach to overcoming some of these hurdles.
Sure.
There is other technological things. So just like this call is being conducted over Skype from the East Coast to the West Coast, we have lots of video conferences to showcase our design work, talk through different design ideas, and then get feedback. As far as the codes and regulations, it's definitely a challenge, particularly going across borders and languages. So for our work in Japan, we've really kind of acted as the design architect.
Okay.
So we're coming up with the conceptual designs, working through all the iterations, really defining the look and feel of that project, probably to what here in the US we would say is like design development phase. And then we are either working directly with or sometimes just handing the project off to a local architect in Japan.
Wow. Okay.
So we've worked with two different ways. The first one was on this community project. We were working with this small town to come up with ideas to renovate an old school building into kind of a community center business incubator space. So we really ran these workshops and did the community engagement work. And then we did, I would say, kind of halfway through schematic design level of work. So we did like a lot of conceptual hand drawings, floor plans, site plans, things like that. But then we handed the work off to a local architect to really bring forward and execute. So he kind of took the concepts and then did all the technical drawings, coordinated the engineering to do all of the renovation work itself.
Yeah, this is actually interesting to point out because I'm not sure people are aware that, I mean, that this happens a lot where architects, even in the same city, someone may hire an architect to do the design, let's say, the concept design, and then there might be someone else brought on to do the construction drawings, or basically the idea is you can begin to subdivide the project if it makes sense. I mean, there might be someone who's very strong in conceptual design and someone who's very strong in the technical drawings, and then you can make a kind of team. It doesn't have to be always that one architect does everything. So that's something to just to mention and underline. It's not just always distance, sometimes just about expertise.
Exactly. And I would say it's a little bit different working across borders.
Sure.
So again, there's language and, I can't even read the Japanese code because it's in Japanese. But even within the United States, like for instance, we're based in Portland, but we're working on a new construction yoga studio in Lubbock, Texas.
Oh my gosh.
And it's a huge learning curve to understand the local rules and regulations, but not just that, the local building culture, common materials, what the local labor are experts in. So in the Pacific Northwest, almost everything's built out of wood, particularly residential projects. Where in Texas, it's for the project we're working on, it's more steel studs and have more access to brick and different materials than we would typically use.
Yeah.
So having a local architect as part of our team is really helpful to understand the rules and regulations that you need to get a project permitted and built, but then also just understanding the local building culture and what is affordable in different regions around the country.
Very interesting. And this sounds like a really mundane question, but I think our listeners would be interested to find out, what do the people that hire you in Japan or in Texas, do they pay for your travel costs, or is that part of your expense, or are you expensing that? How do you work that out?
Great question, and it varies. So for the Texas project, to be honest, we haven't gone there yet. So we've done everything virtually through teleconferencing. So we
Wow.
have all the consultant team that we're working with are based there. So the structural engineer and landscape architect and civil engineers, et cetera, and then the clients. And then we were brought in because they really liked the style that they saw from a couple other yoga studio projects we worked on.
Okay.
We are planning to go, I believe, for to kick off construction, so we can start the construction administration process. But until then, we're going to be doing everything virtual. For Japan, the first contract we had was for this community engagement process, and that they knew that they were bringing a foreign team in to to use kind of like a tech term to be like disruptors and
Yeah.
really kind of break through some of the cultural barriers that might lead to a project being executed in one particular way.
Hmm.
In that case, they flew us out. So
Okay.
our first few trips were part of the design fees covered by the client. However, since the first two trips we made were through the original contract, but also by going there, and then our clients from there came to Portland a couple times as well. So we really built a strong relationship and have become friends outside of just the work.
Yeah.
So after our contract on these community projects were up, we have returned to this town a few times on our own dime just to go visit, see progress, connect with our friends. And by doing that, we actually got a couple other small projects because they saw that it wasn't just us showing up because we were hired to, it was us being passionate about being a member of this community and really giving ourselves back to them as well.
Yeah.
So I think that was a huge tipping point in our relationship with this town, was the fact that we returned a few times covering our own expenses, not asking them for anything other than to hang out and get to spend time together and then see the progress of the work that we've been doing together.
It sounds wonderful. Wait, can I ask what town you've been working in and where it is located in Japan?
Yeah, of course. I should have mentioned that earlier. It's the town of Aritagawa, which
Okay.
is a small agricultural town of about 20 to 25,000 people. And similar to small towns in the US, there's a declining population. The younger community members go off to university in the bigger cities and find jobs and partners, et cetera. They don't
Mm-hmm.
really want to move back to the smaller towns. So the population is rapidly declining. So the kind of purpose of our work there was to really have the townspeople generate new ideas for how they could reinvigorate the town and attract people to move back and give them opportunities beyond just farming.
Yeah.
This town, as far as regionally within Japan, so it's on the western side of the main island in Wakayama Prefecture, and it's about 2 hours south of Osaka by train.
This episode of the Design Your Dream Home podcast is brought to you by CRAN. CRAN is the Custom Residential Architects Network. CRAN is the leading resource and voice for architects who focus on collaborative design with homeowners. CRAN provides support, advocacy, and education for custom residential projects, as well as professional development for its members via forums, symposia, publications, and local activities. To learn more about CRAN, visit www.aia.org/CRAN. This episode of the Design Your Dream Home podcast is brought to you by Porcelanosa. With 30 showrooms in the United States and Canada, Porcelanosa is a luxury lifestyle brand that'll make your next project's dream into a reality. From a wide selection of tiles and mosaics to modern bathroom and kitchen cabinetry designs, Porcelanosa makes it easy to bring modern European design elements into your home. Visit porcelanosa-usa.com to learn more. Well,
So,
Japan
Lucas,
is beautiful. I'm just to mention, when I was in graduate school, I traveled in Japan for a month and a half, and we were in Tokyo, but traveled north to south, and it's a wonderful place. Absolutely stunning architecture and landscape. It was a great experience. So I'm jealous. It sounds like a lot of fun and a really worthwhile experience for you guys.
Yeah, I'm actually going back there next week to check in on the progress and visit with our clients, and then spend a week in Tokyo for a vacation.
Oh, that's great.
So,
Yeah.
Lucas, this is it's interesting to hear about your travels and your experiences in Japan. Love to shift over now to maybe some advice for homeowners that you might be able to give. Any things that you've been thinking about, or advice that you might have that could help homeowners here?
Absolutely. Preparing for this, I was thinking about what are the biggest challenges that we have as designers working with new clients, and what ways to potentially overcome that. And I think that the number one thing is, particularly for residential projects, is they're so intimate. You're designing a home that needs to really fit the unique lifestyles, values, and family needs of each client. Where I find the challenge is has to do with the fact that we need to really understand and know how you want to live, but we spend so little time together with our clients, particularly at the beginning, like before we actually start design work. So we'll meet our clients maybe once or twice for some meetings, maybe have a couple phone calls before they decide to hire us or not. And then we have to understand, or like really like intimately understand their life, and how they want to live as we're starting the design work. And I'm not sure what the right solution is here, but I think the number one thing for me is when we start design work with a new client, we really want to spend as much time as possible, both with the client and not just the person who might be hiring the architect, but with the whole family, to understand what each individual person's goals or values might be for that new home. So, for instance, we have a project that's now under construction just north of Portland, and we interviewed the couple who were funding the project, but it was also important for us to spend time with their daughter, because she has to be living in this house for the next 5 or 10 years as well. So really understanding all of the different wants and needs from each person who's going to be using the spaces is really, really vital. And then not only the people, but for us, and this comes, I think, from some of my experience with the Glenmore class, but really understanding the context that you're building within. So the surrounding landscape, the climate, understanding particular weather patterns. And this also comes into play if you're working internationally or further afield, is if we're designing for Portland, but the building is in Texas, it just wouldn't work. So understanding kind of the context that you're designing for is really vital for a successful project.
I should note that your website is really very client friendly in terms of explaining the process. I sort of want to copy it, but just in terms of explaining the different phases, what to expect, I think you guys do a really good job. I would definitely recommend that to any homeowner. Is it propelstudio.com?
Correct. Yeah.
Go there and take a look at that, because I think it just does kind of lay out in a very simple way. Hey, this is what schematic design is. This is what design development is. This is what construction documents are. And then there's a lot of FAQs, questions that come up, and your answers to those questions. So I think you guys do a really good job with that.
Thank you. I really appreciate that. And we've been working hard at it. I find one of the other challenges we have for each project is really educating our clients on what we do, what our skill set is, the values we bring, and then understanding this process that we go through. I think again, it's a challenge that I find mostly for residential projects, but very few of our residential clients become repeat clients because they're really building their forever home. So we spend so long teaching and facilitating this process that we work through, and then they're at the end of the day they have a great project, but chances are that is the project that they're going to build for their entire life. For some of our commercial project or clients, we might work with them 3, 4, 5 times. So by the second time, they really understand the process we're going through, and we can kind of skip some of the educational aspects of what we have to do. We were really trying to build our website to help break down some of those barriers and give our future clients or potential clients a glimpse into how we work and how we navigate through the design process.
Doug, you want to follow up?
Yeah, I actually don't have any questions. I'm just thinking about what he was talking about. I think what's kind of unusual about their firm, I never really heard an architect talk about clients' forever homes, and I'm not quite sure why. Most of the people that we work with end up designing a number of different properties, right? So we work with them on their home, and then they've got another home elsewhere, and then another home in another location. And so you end up working with them for a long time
Your
on
clients,
lots of
Doug.
different projects. What's that?
Your clients.
Well, no, I'm sorry, they're not my clients. Working with Job Moore in Greenwich. However, it was interesting to hear Lucas say that they work on this home and they spend a lot of time getting very detail oriented in terms of everything that's going into this thing. And then that becomes a home that their clients plan on living in forever. I think that's really wonderful.
So Lucas,
Yeah.
let's say that was number 1 and 2. Do you have a number 3?
I think number 3 is going to be relatively common everywhere, but I think one of the biggest challenges facing architects and their communication with clients has to do with the permitting or entitlement process.
Huh.
Because it's something that is so far outside of our control. And that's something really hard to explain and get people to understand and accept. That it's probably the number one place where misunderstandings or conflicts arise in the design process.
Can you elaborate? What does that mean, the entitlement process? What does that mean?
Yeah, so the entitlement process, it's really about getting all of the approvals you need from the local jurisdiction. So, for instance, the house that's under construction that I mentioned earlier, we had to get it permitted through the city of Portland, but then it also had to go through a series of reviews from the county related to it's in like a sensitive environmental area, so it had environmental overlays and some like view corridor requirements. So we had to really go through this process of adapting the design to meet all the codes and regulations. But then there was also a kind of a redesign phase where we had to take some of the feedback we got from city staff and county reviewers and make adjustments to the design to really address all of their requirements. And I think the challenge is, and this I know is a very prevalent thing in Portland, but I'm sure in many cities as well, is there are some written rules. There are definitely written rules that we can design to as we're working through our process. But there's also a lot of subjective interpretations of those rules. So when we submit our full drawing sets to the city staff to review, what they tell us we need to change isn't necessarily predictable. So there's a process during this permitting phase where there might be changes to some of the decisions that were made earlier. So in this case, it was really about this view corridor overlay that required certain materials, or I guess it was more about, for lack of a better word, it was basically we're looking at reflectivity of different materials, and there was only a certain amount of reflectivity you could have, so it didn't distract people's views through this forested valley. So like we were having to make some design changes on the like window systems and siding materials that we just didn't anticipate, because we didn't know that we would have to have just appease one person's specific requirements rather than what was written to a code.
So our listeners would be really interested in this because we run into the same thing with towns all the time. So are you saying you could go to the town and say, we'd like you to give us not a ruling, but give me an idea as to whether or not what I'm about to build is going to be okay. And you ask them a couple questions, and they verbalize their answers, and then you go back and you make changes and you kind of finalize things, and then you go back to them, and they've given you information that is now changing because somebody else is now looking at one of these issues, and subjectively they've ruled in a different way.
Correct. I find that depending on, when you talk to different people at the city, you sometimes get different answers. So
Gotcha.
that's definitely a challenge. What we've been doing recently, so I would say that anything that you hear in conversation with someone at the city doesn't really count. If it's not documented, it's not real. So that's the first thing, is we make sure that anytime we get any feedback from someone at the city, that we get written documentation that reflects what they're telling us, so we can always reference that
Yes.
for when we need to do it again. Also, here in Portland, there's a few different steps you can go through. So we have what's called an early assistance meeting, where you sit down with the plans reviewer and you can request people from different departments, like, fire review or transportation review, et cetera, to come in, look at your schematic design and give you feedback.
Mm-hmm.
And if you do this early design assistance meeting, it's documented, it's written down, and you also will get assigned the reviewer that will review the building later, which
Okay.
is super valuable.
Yeah.
You can really learn as much as you can before you're making the hard decision, or like the fixed decisions that you do during construction documents.
Mm-hmm.
So hopefully when you get to the actual permitting phase, it's relatively straightforward and you've been able to address most of their concerns. However, on the smaller scale projects, we do a lot of these accessory dwelling units, and there really is no early assistance meeting to go through for those, because they are so small.
Mm-hmm.
And for the most part, we understand and know the codes and regulations, but they're constantly changing. So like every few months, there's a new rule and a new regulation, or the zoning code changed, or something else came up. So we're always kind of trying to stay ahead of these things, but inevitably, once in a while, something changed that you just weren't aware of before you submitted. So there's always this process of making revisions or edits to make sure that the city will approve the project.
Right. It's almost as though you've got to be a lawyer and an architect sometimes.
Yeah. I've gone into some, what I will call, legal arguments with city staff. I don't know if I definitely can't say I'm a lawyer. But yeah, it's a negotiation.
Well, it's good for clients to understand that before you go into it, right?
Exactly. Yeah. And I think the biggest
Oh,
way is, sorry.
I was going to say that it's not always the design either. It's, for me in Boston, it maybe often has to do with parking, making sure there's enough parking. And then in Sarasota, it's about tree removal. I mean, there's certain areas and they all have their own issues, and it's like, oh, we don't want you to remove trees. And I think, okay, I mean, but they grow here very abundantly. It's not a fancy tree, but that's just a big issue there. So I have to really be very careful about trees and make special drawings that explain how we're going to take care of the trees during construction, what we're not going to take away, and so on and so forth. So you do feel like a lawyer to a certain extent. And again, it's not the design. It's like they're not even focused on let's say the house or what it looks like or anything. It's just more like, during the construction, make sure you take care of these trees. I say, okay, got it. And then in Boston, it's like, make sure you have enough parking. So it's interesting. Every city has their own kind of issues, and we do feel like, I don't know, lawyers is right, but we do feel like we have to kind of prove our case. And then, as you sort of hint at, Lucas, is that you don't want to make them mad either, because you don't want to sort of show them up. You just want to sort of try to argue, or not argue, but at least make the case that what you're doing is not going to be harmful and maybe be better in the long run. And they sort of see your way, as opposed to getting upset that you're trying to sort of trick them or whatever. So I think all of us have these kind of stories of entitlement and how difficult it is often to get a permit to build a project.
Yeah, I think that's a great story that kind of explains the situation. I would say like one of the challenges is that we have the building code, which is all the technical performance requirements for the building itself. And to be honest, I think at this point, we've got that one down pretty well. Like
Hmm.
we understand what needs to be done. It's really the zoning codes that really change by, neighborhood to neighborhood or district to district or city to city that kind of throw a bunch of, hurdles in the way. And
Hmm.
those rules and regulations, I think, change a lot quicker. So, anybody who brings up an issue and then the city council votes on it. So like every few months, there could be a new zoning code change. And that's where we really kind of stumble. And we have similar things to what you mentioned, like tree codes, and we have root protection zones that you don't encroach upon, and um, yeah, drainage issues. So like if they don't want sediment to be washed into the sewer system. So there's all these mitigating, rainwater flow off-site. So there's all these like other technical requirements that are beyond the architecture itself that we need to take into consideration and work through.
Um, that's a heavy one. I was just thinking about all these different lawyers that are required in certain jobs, just because it's sort of beyond our scope. Or zoning attorneys are often, there's code consultants, and there's different people that we have to bring in. Sometimes in the case of the trees, like I'll bring in a horticulturist, or so we've got to bring in all these different characters to help entitled projects. So I'm well aware of what you're talking about.
Yeah, yeah.
So Lucas, any last thoughts? We're kind of coming up towards, I guess, 45 minutes plus. So any last thoughts or pieces of advice you can give our homeowners?
I think one word of advice that I would give is I think there needs to be a lot of trust between all of the parties involved in each project.
Mm.
So obviously there's the relationship between the client and the architect. Then you just alluded to this, but then the architect has a team of consultants for all of these various, technical issues. So structural engineers, civil engineers, landscape architects, maybe arborists in some situations, or code consultants. Then there's also of course, the general contractor, so the one who's building the project. So they're another entity who's coming into play. And then the design process itself is so long, and there's so many different competing forces that you start in one place and inevitably you end up somewhere very different. So on just being able to trust that process and allow the design to shift and morph over time based on all of the feedback and input you're getting from all of these different parties along the way is super vital to making a successful project. So it's never just the architect's ego trying to make the perfect design according to their values. It's never going to be just what the client sketched out on a piece of graph paper before they hired the architect. It's going to be a continual evolving, morphing design that changes throughout the entire process. I think that's really where we were trying to what we try to explain on the website with kind of the process we go through. And that's really what we're doing for each of our clients, is really, embarking on this journey that hopefully arrives at a project that everyone's happy with and proud of and excited to live in.
Wow. Yeah, really well said. I think the overall message I'm getting here is that for our listeners, nothing is really as it seems, that there are so many layers to the process and the people involved in these projects. And by hiring an architect, you really kind of you're getting a head start, and you're getting a look into, or a peeling back of the curtain into a lot of things that you otherwise would be discovering in really challenging ways. So thank you very much, Lucas. It's been great.
Yeah, you're welcome. I really appreciate you having me on the show.
Where can people find you, Lucas?
People can find us on our website, www.propelstudio.com, or people are also welcome to email me directly. My email address is Lucas, Lucas, @propelstudio.com.
Awesome. Thank you very much, Lucas. Really appreciate it.
All right, man. Thank you.
Wonderful. Yeah, thank you so much.
So before we end today's show, I just want to acknowledge someone who wrote in, and I thought it was a nice email, and I just wanted to kind of mention her name is Ava. She talked about how her and her mom are building a new house in Long Island, and we're listening to the podcast to get sort of ideas and some advice. And I think there was some. She had mentioned really being appreciative of the tips on costs, advice about kitchens, hurricane resilience, etc. And then she also mentions that maybe, she asked if we might consider future podcasts which would focus on passive design, net zero homes, and also custom modular or prefab home companies. And I think both Doug and I know people in these spaces. So definitely, I think that's a great idea. And we'll reach out to some of the people that we know in these areas. And I think that would definitely, if our audience is interested, then that would be great. I mean, we'll do that. So thank you very much, Ava, for your call. Good luck on your home design in Long Island, and feel free to let us know how that's going. We'd love to hear how that turned out.
Yeah, and let me add, she should listen to, if she hasn't already, the Norm Horn interview, because we do talk about some net zero stuff and some passive design. We touch on the subject in that interview as well.
But one of the firms she had mentioned, Zero Energy Design, they're in Boston, and I know them, so we can definitely have them. And
that's awesome.
Also, Bensonwood is one of the prefab companies that's in, gosh, are they in New Hampshire? But I've been to their shop, and I know one of the engineers there, so we could definitely have them as well. And
I would love to talk to a prefab.
Yeah, business. It's really interesting stuff. So I love seeing their factory. So definitely, we can definitely get someone from Bensonwood. So thank you very much, Ava, and thank you for listening.
You've been listening to the Design Your Dream Home podcast with Doug and Steve. If you have any questions or want to give us any feedback on the show, feel free to reach us through our website at thedougandsteveshow.com. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you next time.